everyone. Welcome to the Premed Experience. I'm so happy you could attend the event live with us. Most of you probably know me from Instagram or TikTok, but if I will link all that info in the comments. I try to post helpful stuff for pre-meds and tips from a medical student perspective. So definitely check me out. It's at White Coats and Corgis if that's something of interest to you. And yeah, I'm so happy this event is finally here. I've been working on this for almost 6 months now, and I can't wait for you all to meet the amazing presenters I've gathered here for us today. For me, the goal of this event was to increase accessibility to experts who can help you get into medical school and eventually reach your goal of becoming a doctor. So we have some incredibly knowledgeable experts speaking today, from MCAT tutors to admissions committee members to even medical school deans. So please take advantage of their wisdom and their advice. Next, we're going to hear from two physicians who have served on medical school admissions committees. They are going to show us a little bit about what medical schools are looking for in 2023 and how you can make yourself stand out as an applicant. There will also be a short Q&A at the end of the presentation, so feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Renee Marinelli and Dr. Ziggy Udiano.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. This is really exciting. Hi, Ziggy.
Hello, how are you?
Where are you located?
I am in sunny, semi-warm North Carolina right now. I wish you were warmer.
Well, thanks everyone so much again for hopping on this morning. Hopefully this should be pretty interactive. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's get started. So I'm Dr. Marinelli. I work with Med School Coach as the Director of Advising, and Med School Coach is one of the sponsors for this event today. And we are a group of physicians that serve as advisors for people that are applying to medical school. And so I've been with Med School Coach now for over 7 years, and Dr. Udiano is also one of our associate directors of advising, and he's been with us for 4 years?
Yes.
Oh, coming on 4 years, over 4 years. So, I mean, we've just worked with a ton of different students and have seen kind of the gamut of people come through with their individual situations and really all the changes in admissions. So thanks for being here, Dr. Udiano. Hopefully we can take you guys through some, ideas on how to successfully apply to medical school. And, hopefully if you're applying this year or next year or the next 5 years, you can kind of put some things together to make sure that your application is well received by admissions committees. So let's get right down to it. So we're going to be talking about a lot of information, but please scan this QR code. This is the QR code for our guidebook to becoming a physician. It's a great guidebook. It's completely free. We've been, adding to this guidebook and changing it for years now. And so it's become super exhaustive and complete, and really is like kept up with all the admissions trends and the things that have come up in the last few years, which we'll talk about today. But please scan this and download it because all the information we'll cover here will be in this as well. So you can always have this as a reference. So I always like to set the stage to talk about how competitive it is to get into medical school. And probably most of you out there know this, but I think it's always super helpful to see the data and kind of at least get an idea of, where you might stand and like what you're up against, because that really sets the stage of how important it is to really maximize your application. So interestingly enough, in the last couple of years, and what we think is due to the pandemic, there was a huge increase in applicants to medical school, but unfortunately that didn't translate into increase in number of seats in medical school. That just increased the number of applicants. So it just became more competitive. And the GPA and MCAT just kind of have risen a little bit every single year, but have held pretty steady as far as the average matriculant GPA and average matriculant MCAT, which I have up there. But those numbers of people have increased. And unfortunately, that means less people are getting into medical school each year. And right now where it stands, it's, less than about 40% of applicants actually get into medical school when they apply. So it's just uber competitive. And, it's one of those things where everybody knows it's competitive, but once you get to the nitty gritty of it, you really, really have to make sure that your application is just stellar and exceptional in order to really stand out against, you know, the 60,000 plus applicants that are applying every single year. So let's talk about how you can do that. What we're going to cover today are multiple steps I kind of like to lay out that you can do. And I'll let Ziggy take the next slide after this, so you don't have to just keep hearing me talk. But, you know, preparing and planning is just so important. Submitting on time, preparing again for your secondary applications and the next steps in your application, like interviewing. So if you kind of follow all these steps, then you are going to be set up for success. So the next slide, Ziggy, if you wouldn't mind taking this one, is kind of just an overview of the application process. Do you want to talk through this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, as you can see from the slide, you know, to use a very common metaphor, this is not a sprint. This is a marathon, basically. And this means, you know, each month there's something, you know, very, very important to do in terms of the milestones. Obviously, you guys can read this slide yourself, but if you look, you know, between January and April, for example, request letters of recommendation, study for the MCAT. One of the things I would say, you know, I'll try to delve deeper into each of the things written here, basically, you know, in terms of requesting letters of recommendation, this is something that you should try to do as early as possible, basically. If you know in January or February who you want to ask, I would start asking them. And a common question that I get asked is, oh, when should I tell them to submit the letter of recommendation? Well, the earliest that you can submit is usually at the beginning of May, when you can start registering for your MCAS, basically. And I always tell my clients to aim for, you know, sometime in May, basically, because the thing you have to remember is, you know, the people whom you're asking letters of recommendation from are doing 1,000,001 things, basically. And even when you ask them, you know, to submit at a certain time, they don't always do it. So one of these skills, for better or worse, that you guys are going to learn is the fine art of pestering without looking like you're pestering them, basically, just to make sure that they're actually working on the letter, that they're going to remember to turn it in, you know, all of those kind of things are important. The second thing that's written there is, yes, studying for the MCAT, basically. You know, if you can, you know, some people even take it before then, but if you can take it sometime in the first few months before May, which is when you use, you know, end of May, when you're going to submit the primary application, basically, that's a good way to go. The latest that I personally recommend that my clients take the MCAT is no later than end of May, early June. When you start taking it later than then, there's kind of a domino effect that affects, you know, sort of the secondaries and interviews and all of that kind of stuff. You know, and then from May to June here, you know, it says there, take the MCAT if not completed. Yes, complete the MCAS application. Usually the earliest you can start submitting is end of May, early June. I think this year it's like May 30th or something like that. Yes, you want to get those transcripts in. And again, the application, so important. I've had clients sometimes where I look at the date when they submitted, not my clients, well, clients who are reapplying. And one of the first things I look at is when did they submit their primary application before? And sometimes I see things like July, August, even end of June. And that is just way too late. This is, you know, it's so hyper competitive now. You want every advantage that you can get in terms of, you know, differentiating yourself from the field. And being an early submitter is one thing that's really going to help, basically. Next thing, yes, oh boy, July to August, prepare secondary applications. So I think this will be news to nobody to hear that this is basically like a tsunami of applications that kind of occurs around that time, basically. And, you know, especially when you're applying to maybe between 25, 30, 40, you know, medical schools, basically. The key here is, you know, hyper organized preparation, basically. You really have to schedule, you know what you're going to do in terms of your secondaries. We recommend trying to submit each secondary within 2 to 3 weeks, no later than a month if possible. I know it's really hard in the context of everything else you guys are doing, basically, but again, it makes a difference. Of course, you don't want to sacrifice quality when you're working on your secondaries. Obviously, there are going to be questions that are repetitive that you can sort of reuse your answer, but you have to remember to try to personalize it to the medical school too. I can't tell you how many times I see applications where they're applying to Cornell, but they have something like Baylor written in their answer, basically. So you want to be mindful of that, basically. And then, September, as you can see here, September to April, yes, long window for the interviews, and following up with schools, sending update letters. This is, one of the questions I often get asked by clients, well, I submitted my application and secondary so early, how come I haven't gotten any interviews yet? And the answer is sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to when medical schools are inviting you for interviews. Of course, earlier is still better, but I've definitely had applicants who submitted as soon as possible for everything. And then I remember one client, she finally got one interview in October, and then the rest kind of came in January. Why that happened, I don't know, basically, but it shouldn't prevent you from trying to submit as early as possible. And we'll talk more about the interview later, but that's something you really want to prepare for too. And then as you can see here, May to June, hopefully you guys will have lots and lots of, admissions and can make admissions decisions. And then, oh, wow, okay, it's already going to be August and you're going to start medical school. So awesome.
Thanks, Ziggy. Yeah, it's a lot to go through and it's kind of a lot to understand, but I do like how this kind of lays it out. And one thing to pay attention to is August of the following year. So this whole process of applying to medical school is usually about a year and a half that you're actually going to be submitting your application. And then when you actually matriculate into medical school, it's over a year later. So it is absolutely a marathon. And there's just these key components to it that you really, really have to do right. And so let's talk a little bit about some of those specifically. So Ziggy, you mentioned the key dates. So each application that you're applying to has different dates. So AMCAS is the traditional MD application across the United States. Besides Texas uses TMD SAS, and then AO-COMAS is the osteopathic application. So some people apply to one of these, some people apply to all three of them. And it really depends on your individual circumstances and how competitive you are. If you're a Texas resident, most people are going to apply to TMD SAS as well. Texas highly, highly favors their own state residents. So if you're not a Texas resident, you can consider it, but it's kind of individual circumstances. But most Texas residents are absolutely using that as well. So the application dates, as far as when they open, so when they open, you can actually start going in there, typing in your information, getting your transcript submitted, things like that. They're all about the same. And I put these ones in asterisks because these are accurate for this year. AO-COMAS has not announced their dates. So this was based on last year. So we don't know for sure if they changed it at all this year. And then submission, as Ziggy said, this is where it's really key. This is when you can actually hit submit and the application will begin its processing part. So what happens is you hit submit, and AMCAS will go through, and I'm going to talk mostly about AMCAS since that's kind of the bulk of medical schools use AMCAS. They'll go through and they're going to verify your entire application. They're going to look at your official transcript versus what you entered on the application and make sure that it's all the same and it's all accurate. And so that verification process, if you're one of the earliest people to submit your application, it usually only takes a few days. But as time goes on, there's more and more people submitting. There's thousands of applications being poured in that are submitted, and now they have to verify it. That process takes longer. So you want to be one of those earlier people to get it verified so that once it's verified, it can be sent to medical schools. Otherwise, if you submit like in August, it can take like up to 6 weeks to get verified. And so then your application is not actually being sent to medical schools until September, which is late. And you do not want to be one of those late people because medical schools are reviewing applications as they come in. So you want to be one of those earliest people as possible. You don't have to submit on May 30th, but sometime in early June is absolutely like where you want to hit. So when you're putting together your application, one of the main components of the application is going to be talking about your activities. And I'm going to speak a little bit about these activities based on how you want to put them in your application for those that are applying like soon, but then also talk to you a little bit about like if you're planning some of these activities, you know, the kind of core activities you want to look to have are research, clinical work, community service, shadowing, and leadership. I think, and Ziggy, you probably agree with this, you know, what makes the best activities are if they're longitudinal, meaning like you've been committed to this activity for a long time. It wasn't just something you did for a week or a month and then quit and did something else. You like actually found something and committed to it and grew into that role. I love those types of activities. If you could become a leader in something, so you're really taking it from just being a volunteer or a participant into somebody that's really grown into leadership role, that is awesome. I love activities that are original ideas. Like I've seen people start like a nonprofit organization. I've seen people start a tutoring organization, things like that, where they've really like taken something that they feel passionate about and gone to the next level. Those are going to help stand out. And then like international activities can be super great. And I know later on, I think we have a presentation from one of our sponsors from Global Medical Brigades to talk a little bit about like their international opportunities, which I think are great experiences for pre-meds to put on their application, just to share a different perspective. And, you know, you really gain a lot from being in another culture and setting. Ziggy, do you have any other thoughts on extracurricular activities?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the main criteria that Dr. Marinelli said was about being longitudinal. And this is really critical, this long-term commitment, because it also enables you to demonstrate other sort of meet other qualitative metrics that medical schools care about. For example, you know, for any endeavor that you're part of, you want to demonstrate evolution and growth, basically, right? You never want to look stagnant, basically. And you have to remember, you're going to be writing about this on your work activity section. It might be in your personal statements, secondaries, interviews. So this is the foundation for a lot of it, basically. So, you know, later on, you know, one of the things you want to keep in mind as you're sort of going through these experiences is thinking about how you've been able to, you know, either evolve or gain, you know, new knowledge skills, a new knowledge set, you know, skills, approaches to thinking, so important, basically. The other type of qualitative metric that I think is really important that almost no client really ever thinks about is what I would say is results, basically. You have to remember, you're not just doing things to do things, right? You're doing things to an end, basically, to have an impact, to to have a specific kind of result. You know, one of the most common ways that we know about the results is, you know, publications and presentations for research. But I would also argue for something like, you know, if you're the fundraising chair for an organization and you raise $5,000 one year, $10,000 the next year, well, you would want to note that on your work activity section later and then detail what you did to get that extra $5,000. Maybe you created new strategic partnerships, you came up with a new marketing campaign. And so by explaining what you did, you are already inherently sort of conveying and marketing yourself in a very positive way, basically. And just the last thing I will add real quickly about research is a common question that I'm sure also Renee gets asked is, do I have to do research if I'm not interested in doing research later on as part of my career? And as somebody who hated research with a passion, I can tell you, unfortunately, well, maybe back a million years ago when I applied, it was different. But these days, unfortunately, the answer is yes. They want to see some experience with research. It doesn't mean you have to have publications, but they do want to see that you've done it. Obviously, if you are focused on research, you should try to get the publications. You should try to do the presentations. And if you're not, that might just mean that you're going to focus more on medical schools that are more primary care oriented. But, you know, to be fair, they also do research too.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think the same, you know, I remember when I applied to medical school, research was kind of like almost like icing on the cake type of thing, where now it's pretty much expected for you to have research. Otherwise, you know, that's going to be a pretty big hole in your application compared to the other competitive applicants. going on, so just to make sure we've got plenty of time to answer questions, there's a lot of great questions coming in. And again, we won't be able to get to all of these for sure, because there's just so many. But as I said, later on today, Dr. Yodiano will be hosting a Q&A. So please be sure to bring your questions there. So the other big aspect of your primary application, your AMCAS application, is your personal statement. And we have webinars and talks just on an hour of talking about the personal statement itself, because it is so important. And it really can make a huge, huge difference in your application. I always think about like, and Ziggy, you probably heard me say this like a million times, but I think it's just so relevant. You know, if you were an admissions officer and you have 5,000 applications to review, after a while, when you're looking at personal statements, you're going to like read the first few sentences. And if it doesn't really catch your eye, you're probably going to read it and then put it aside and just move on. But if you can create a personal statement that is really captivating and interesting, that admissions committee member is going to start reading it, and then they're going to like be hooked and want to continue reading it and read it in its entirety. And that's going to really stick with them, and you're going to stand out with the personal statement. And I can still even recall, like, after working with probably close to thousands of applicants at this point, personal statements that we worked on together that have really, really stood out to me. And so, you know, it's not impossible to do, but it takes a ton of work and it takes a lot of preparation and thought. So I won't spend a ton of time on this slide, because again, this is like a whole rabbit hole of a discussion by itself. But, you know, having a personal statement that is going to be really compelling, really tell your story, emphasizing your strengths and your interest in medicine is going to, you know, go a long, long way. So Ziggy mentioned this earlier. So after you submit that primary application, we just kind of talked about those pieces that go into the primary application. Then it's secondary application time. And so secondaries, I saw a couple of questions in the chat where people weren't totally sure what secondary applications are. So for pretty much every school you apply to, and most people, you know, we recommend applying to somewhere between like 30 to 40 medical schools. So if you're applying, let's say, to 40 medical schools, most of those medical schools are going to send you a secondary application request, which is a form of essay questions, really. And so you'll probably get 95% of secondaries from the schools you applied to. And then all of those have maybe 3 to 5 essay questions, and they totally vary in length. There's one like UCSD that's like a 5,000 word autobiography. And then there's some that are just pretty short questions and turn out to be short essays. But the difficulty with this is that you don't really know how you're going to receive them. Sometimes you receive 1 in a week. Sometimes you receive 7 requests in a week. And as Ziggy said, you really want to turn them around within 2 to 3 weeks to show your interest and like your level of effort for that school. And so if you all of a sudden receive 7 different essays requests, it's going to be really hard to complete those appropriately and turn them around and, you know, with good quality quickly. So preparing them is so important. And our sister website, perspectivedoctor.com, we have all of the secondary essay prompts from the year before. This is a very old screenshot, so ignore the 2017 to 2018. We update these every year. And basically schools will send these essays, and then they don't change much from year to year. So what we recommend doing is logging on there, going through your school list and pulling up those essay questions from the previous years and start typing them out. And so then once you actually receive that secondary application from that school, you can pretty much turn it around and submit it very, very quickly. This is a great way to do it. I wish I had known about, I don't think a resource like this existed when I applied to medical school. Otherwise, I totally would have used it, because I remember I was like drowning in secondaries. And if you don't prepare, you definitely drown in secondaries, and it becomes just so time consuming and really, really just difficult to write that many essay questions. Ziggy, any other thoughts?
No, I totally agree. Just, yes, be prepared. You don't want to drown. everything you said, Renee, is like 100%. And I totally agree. I wish I had this database back then. I don't think I even had internet, so that's a whole nother issue.
We're really dating ourselves right now. I had internet. I'll say that. I had email. So, all right, let's move on. So don't forget the virtual assessments. And I always kind of laugh at this slide because here's another thing that has changed since Ziggy and I applied to medical school. There are all of these virtual assessments now. And basically it is the Altus Suite, which actually just changed its name to Altus Insights. And so this is a private third-party company that does some virtual assessments, including the Casper, the snapshot, and why am I blanking on the last one?
Duet,
thank you. And basically, these are just different virtual things that you take at home, and they're kind of just testing some of your interpersonal skills. Some of it's live interviewing, some of it's answering questions. Not every school requires that you do these, but more and more schools every year are requiring this. There's also the Kira talent exam, which only a few schools have been using. And then there's also the AMC has the preview virtual assessment, which more medical schools are using. I want to say it's like up to 30 to 40 right now at this point. I'm not going to talk a ton about this. There's a lot of resources out there. You should prepare about this and think about it. But this is just something I always put on people's radar early on, because I find that it really sneaks up on applicants. They're like, oh, I didn't realize I have to take the CASPER exam, or I didn't realize that this school requires the preview. And now that's something I need to prepare for and plan for. So what you should start doing is when you make that school list, looking at those schools' individual requirements. They're going to tell you if they require these exams. And so once you start compiling that school list, then you can compile like what these additional requirements are. So then you can be like, okay, hey, I know that in June, I'm probably going to get an invitation to take the preview exam. Let me prepare for that now. So then when I get that invitation, I'm ready to go. And some of these are self-scheduled, like the Altus one is self-scheduled, but preview, you actually have to get an invitation from the school to take it. So a lot of nuances here, but again, just want to like put it out there. So when you're applying, you don't hear about these for the first time. You're kind of at least starting to think about it and get the gears churning. And then finally, the last step of that application year, over a year, is the interview. Z, you want to talk about the interviews a little bit?
Sure. I'm in the midst of doing tons of mock interviews still, so it's really fresh on my brain, basically, right? So, you know, as the slide says, rock your interview. So I think that's a good approach to it, basically. So, it's the interview. This is a very important, every part of the application, of course, is very important. But, by the time, if you're getting an interview invite, that means that they really see a lot of qualities about you that they really feel is a great fit for their medical school, basically. And once you get that interview invite, the chances of you're getting accepted is much higher at that point versus when you're just in the general applicant pool, basically. And, there's different ways, right now, of course, there are some interviews that are happening in person. There are some that are happening virtually. And sometimes there's some little nuances to doing those that we could talk a little bit about if you want. As it says here, be personable, outgoing, kind. Absolutely. One of the things that I would add, sort of just aside from what's on the slide here, is preparation is so important, basically. There are some commonly asked questions, and I'm sure Renee can relate to this, such as, why do you want to come to our medical school? Tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your greatest weakness? What questions do you have for that? These are very commonly asked questions, which actually applicants often know that they're going to get asked, but it's really interesting that when I practice with a lot of applicants and hear their answers, they're very mediocre at best, basically. And I think a big part of the reason is sort of part of it is lack of preparation. I think sometimes one underestimates how easy it is to answer those kind of questions, especially when it's like, tell me about yourself, which actually is, I would argue, one of the hardest questions to answer, because condensing like 2 decades plus of your life into 3 to 4 minutes in a meaningful way is like, that is really, really hard. And unfortunately, a lot of answers resemble a car driving without a GPS, basically. And so, you know, you really want to, you know, we can't emphasize this enough, and we can talk more if there are questions related to this. But for those kind of questions, you really want to do a lot of research, preparation, and practice ahead of time. This is something where you have a lot of control over, to an extent. Of course, you can't control the questions that are being asked to you, but you know, it's really worth putting the time and effort. And I know at this stage, it's kind of like the end of the marathon and you're tired and you want to sleep, but you kind of need that second wind right then to like make it past the finish line, which you guys can all do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Don't hit the wall of the marathon. If anybody's run long distances, most people know about the wall. This is like hitting the wall. Don't hit the wall, like get past it, get those skills so that you can just really do well and make such a lasting impression on your interview. And I think, like you said, I get some people too that are like, well, you know, I work, I've interviewed for jobs. Like, do I really need to prepare or like do mock interviews? And it's like, yes, because those types of interviews are going to be very different, and the pressure is different. You're with kind of, you know, esteemed professionals a lot of times with your interviews, very it just, and the stakes are a lot higher too, because you know, you may have gotten a few interviews and that's it. Like, if you don't do well on your interview, then you're going to get rejected. And so I think absolutely, like, preparing very, very well and taking it seriously, even if you've had practice before, is just key here. So we're going to start to wrap up. So we kind of talked about all of those steps. So just a reminder of kind of bringing it all together, you know, your grades, your MCAT, we didn't talk in depth about these, but they are just so, so important to really get your application through that like initial screen and have them review it further and really look at it and say, hey, this is somebody has the academic capabilities to do well in medical school. Let's look at them further. And then the rest of it is putting together this awesome application with having extracurriculars that are going to be defining and really compelling to you as an individual and as an applicant. Your personal narrative of who you are, why you're here, what strengths you have, and really making that stand out and being exceptional. And then finally putting that interview together. And now you're more than somebody that they've seen on paper. You're actually going to the school or being on Zoom and showing them that you're an actual person who's going to communicate well. You're going to be somebody that they want to work with and have as their peer in medical school. So all of these things are just so important. And hopefully I know we went through a lot of this stuff very, very fast, but because everybody's at such different stages, we wanted to give like an overview of the pieces that are going to make you successful to be an applicant to medical school. You know, talk to us. We'd love to hear about your individual situation and, you know, give you specific recommendations. There's so many good questions out there, and I know we won't get to them all in the last 20 minutes or so. So please scan this QR code and talk to us. We'll kind of talk you through your situation and help you through your questions and get you connected with the right help. And then finally, I'm going to just put this on here. I'll go back to the enrollment consultation, but this is the QR code again for that document. So please be sure to scan that, but I'll keep this up for another minute and we'll start answering some of these questions. There's so many good ones. What I'm going to try to do is try to take some common ones that I see and bring them together. So hopefully we're kind of answering multiple questions at a time, but again, we won't get to all of these. So please join the Q&A with Dr. Yodiano later.